What power could transform a forgotten barmaid into the mother of emperors and the finder of the cross that bore salvation? Good evening, dear listeners. Wherever you are, perhaps resting after a long day or preparing for quiet prayer, welcome to Saint Lives. Settle in, breathe, and subscribe before we begin. This is the story of Saint Helena, the humble woman who rose from obscurity to empire, from rejection to revelation, and whose faith turned humiliation into holy purpose, uncovering the very wood that bore Christ's redeeming sacrifice. In the small coastal town of Drepanum, where the sea brushed softly against the stones and fishermen sang beneath the rising sun, a girl named Helena was born into obscurity. The world she entered knew nothing of her destiny. Her mother's hands were rough from labor. Her father's voice carried the weariness of survival. No noble lineage, no fortune, no divine omen marked her birth. Only the scent of salt and the murmuring waves, as though heaven itself had whispered that greatness sometimes begins in silence. Helena grew up among the noise of taverns and the weary laughter of soldiers returning from distant campaigns. She swept floors, carried jugs of wine, and watched faces she would never see again. In those dimly lit corners, where the poor gathered to forget their hunger for an hour, her gentleness shone without pretense. The men around her spoke of empires and victories, but Helena spoke only in kindness. She had learned early that the simplest compassion could quiet even the harshest soul. Her beauty was not the polished beauty of nobility. It was the kind that lingered in stillness. Her eyes, soft and dark, seemed always to listen. Perhaps that was what drew people to her, the quiet dignity that came not from privilege, but from patience. In her service, she found rhythm. In her humility, a strange strength. The tavern was a place of laughter and sin, of coins exchanged and secrets spilled, yet in Helena's presence it felt a little less cruel. She lived as one unseen, yet fully awake to the needs of others. In every weary traveler she saw a brother, in every wounded soldier a son of God. It was not theology she practiced, but mercy. At night, when the shutters closed and the sea breeze cooled the air, she would gaze toward the horizon and wonder what lay beyond it. She knew of emperors and wars only through rumor, yet even then she felt that her life held a purpose larger than the walls of Drepanum. Still, such thoughts were fleeting. The poor did not dream too long. Dreams were fragile things. Instead, she prayed quietly, not for wealth or escape, but for peace. Peace in her heart. Peace for those she served. Her prayers were like the sea itself, constant, deep, and often unheard. But heaven was listening. In time, her path would cross that of a man whose choices would shape history. Yet in this beginning, she remained the barmaid of Drepanum, unaware that the world beyond her small town was turning toward her. When soldiers came through the port, she offered them food and drink, not knowing that among them one would soon change her life. The sound of armor, the scent of dust and leather, the glint of sunlight on metal, all were ordinary to her, until the day they were not. For now, she lived in stillness, her destiny waiting quietly beneath the surface of ordinary days. And perhaps this is where all sanctity begins, not in the great halls of power, but in the humble act of serving others with love. Helena's life reminds us that holiness often hides in simplicity, and that God's greatest stories begin in forgotten places. The tavern girl who swept the floors of Drepanum was already known in heaven by another name, the Finder of the Cross. But such titles belong to the end of the road, not the beginning. For now she belonged only to the sea, the quiet town, and the unseen grace that watched over her. Sometimes heaven hides its greatest designs in the simplest lies. The years in Drepanum passed softly, and Helena's life unfolded much like the tides that rose and fell outside her window. Quiet, persistent, never truly still. Each dawn, she opened her eyes to the same streets, the same faces, the same weary rhythm of toil. Yet within her, something was changing. Where others saw monotony, she sensed meaning. The humble work of serving wine, tending to travelers, and sweeping away the ashes of the night became her form of prayer. She never imagined that her gentleness, unnoticed by the world, was shaping her soul for a destiny no one could foresee. And then, one afternoon, as the light fell golden across the narrow lanes, he came, Constantius Chlorus, a Roman officer, commanding yet composed, a man whose presence seemed to alter the air itself. He had come with his unit to rest on their way to the western campaigns, his armor gleaming with the wear of long marches. In the dim light of the tavern, Helena noticed not his rank, but the weariness behind his confident smile, the quiet calculation in his eyes that spoke of the burdens of command. Their meeting was not the thunderclap of romance that poets imagine. It was something smaller, quieter, a kindness exchanged over a cup of water, a pause between duties. Constantius spoke with the ease of one accustomed to authority, but Helena's responses carried a calm that disarmed him. Unlike others who sought his favor, she did not flatter. Her simplicity became a mirror, reflecting the humanity he too often had to conceal beneath the armor of ambition. He found reasons to linger in Drepanum longer than he needed, offering small gestures of courtesy that slowly unfolded into affection. The tavern girl, so unlike the noblewomen of Rome, carried a grace born not of breeding, but of endurance. Rumors stirred, as they always do when the powerful are seen among the lowly, but Helena bore the whispers with serenity. To her, love was not conquest or escape. It was a gentle recognition of shared loneliness. Constantius was drawn not merely to her beauty, but to the peace that surrounded her. In her company, he found something he had not known since his youth, a sense of stillness, of home. When he asked her to travel with him, she hesitated only long enough to pray. To leave Drepanum was to leave everything she had ever known. Yet something in her heart whispered that her journey wasn't meant to end here. And so she went, not as a bride in splendor, but as a companion in humility. Their life together began without ceremony. In the eyes of the Roman elite, Helena was no match for a rising officer. Yet Constantius cared little for the judgment of courtiers. He loved her with a sincerity that defied custom, and she loved him with a faith that softened the rough edges of ambition. They lived simply, moving as the tides of his service demanded, through provinces and garrisons, among soldiers and strangers. Helena adapted to each change with quiet grace, content in the knowledge that love, however fragile, had found her. She bore his child, Constantine, in a modest dwelling far from the grandeur of Rome. When she first held the infant in her arms, she wept, sensing in him a destiny greater than she could understand. His eyes, sharp and alert even in infancy, reflected his father's strength and her own gentleness. Motherhood deepened the currents of her soul. She rose each day to tend to her child, her heart wrapped around him like a prayer. She watched him grow amid the uncertainties of a soldier's life, teaching him kindness amid discipline, compassion amid command. The boy learned early to ride and to read, but Helena ensured he also learned to kneel. She told him of the God who watches over the small and forgotten, who brings light from suffering and hope from humiliation. Constantine listened, though his young mind was still shaped by the world of swords and banners. Yet something of her faith settled deep within him, a seed that would one day move an empire. But empires are built on ambition, and ambition seldom spares the heart. As Constantius climbed the ranks, the pressures of politics began to weigh heavily. The court expected alliances, marriages, and heirs that would strengthen imperial ties. Helena, though faithful and devoted, had no noble blood to offer. Her presence became an inconvenience whispered about in corridors. When messengers came bearing promises of advancement, the price was clear. To rise higher, Constantius must leave her behind. The decision, when it came, was not spoken with cruelty, but with the cold inevitability of duty. Helena, ever composed, listened in silence as the man she had loved spoke of reasons and necessity. She understood, even as her heart cracked beneath the weight of the words. That night, when the camp lay silent and the stars watched from above, she wept. Not for the loss of luxury, for she had never known it, but for the breaking of the bond that had been her life's anchor. Yet even in sorrow, she did not curse him. Instead, she prayed. She prayed for Constantius, for the child who would grow between two worlds, and for the strength to endure what must come. Her tears fell like offerings at the altar of her faith, and when dawn came, she rose with the same quiet dignity that had always defined her. She would not plead or beg. She would walk her path alone, trusting that God's plan was not undone by man's ambition. And so, Helena found herself once again adrift, though this time the sea was not outside her door, but within her heart. She returned to a life of obscurity, raising her son with devotion, while the world beyond her walls shifted in turmoil. Constantine grew strong under her watch, learning resilience from her silence and courage from her prayers. Helena carried herself with a serenity that belied her pain. She had lost everything the world deems valuable: status, security, affection. Yet she gained something infinitely greater: the strength born of surrender. And in that surrender, the first faint outlines of sanctity began to appear. She did not yet know that her humiliation would one day be transfigured into holiness, that her broken heart would become a vessel for the world's most sacred relic. For now, she simply lived, faithful, uncomplaining, and unseen. Evening after evening, she would sit by the window, watching the horizon fade into dusk, whispering prayers for the man who had left her and the child who would one day carry both their names into eternity. Her loneliness became her offering, her sorrow her song. And though no one in Drepanum could have imagined it, the story of the forsaken barmaid and the ambitious soldier had already become a thread in the vast tapestry of salvation history. The world had turned its gaze away from her, but heaven never did. In the stillness of her solitude, God was already preparing the next chapter of her journey: the rise of her son, the fall of her grief, and the unfolding of a purpose that would stretch from the taverns of Drepanum to the hills of Calvary. Even in love, God sometimes sows the seeds of sorrow. Years passed, and the world began to tremble under the march of empire. Constantius had risen high within the ranks of Rome, his ambitions finally realized. But though Helena no longer stood beside him, a part of her heart still followed the path of his triumphs, not out of longing, but out of quiet remembrance. She had once loved him sincerely, and true love, even when broken, does not die easily. Yet her attention, her prayers, and her hopes now gathered around her son, Constantine. He had grown tall and steady, with eyes that carried both his father's commanding fire and his mother's deep calm. In him, Helena saw not merely her child, but a destiny unfolding before her eyes. She nurtured his mind and spirit, teaching him to read the scriptures that were whispered among the early Christians, to speak with justice, and to treat even servants with respect. She never allowed bitterness to poison her words when he asked about his father. "He chose the road laid before him," she would say softly, "and you, my son, must walk yours with honor." Constantine's youth was shaped by movement, by the restless pulse of an empire in transition. He traveled with armies, learned the art of command, and saw firsthand the beauty and cruelty of the Roman world. But even amid the brutality of camp life, he carried with him the silent influence of his mother's faith. He remembered the nights she knelt before the small wooden cross she kept hidden, her lips moving in prayer. He remembered the gentleness with which she helped the poor and the wounded, how she never passed by suffering without pausing to comfort it. He learned that power without compassion was emptiness. Helena, in her obscurity, had become the teacher of an emperor. There came a day when messages arrived bearing news that Constantius had been elevated again, his power nearly supreme. He had taken a noble wife and forged alliances that strengthened his claim to rule. Helena received the news with composure, though it stirred old pain. But she turned her eyes to Constantine and saw in him the continuation of everything she had lost. "Do not let your heart harden, my son," she told him. "The world may forget us, but God never does." He nodded, though he did not yet understand. For the heart of a young man is drawn to glory, and the whisper of destiny already called him toward Rome. When Constantine was summoned to join his father, Helena watched him depart with both pride and sorrow. The road to greatness would be long, and it would demand sacrifices she could not foresee. Yet she trusted in the quiet promise that had carried her through every storm, that God writes straight with crooked lines. She prayed for her son's safety, and for the grace that had once sustained her to flow now through him. Alone again, she returned to the rhythm of her days, living simply, serving the poor, and spending her evenings in reflection. Her life seemed small, but heaven was measuring it in another scale entirely. Meanwhile, Constantine's star rose swiftly. His courage and intelligence earned the loyalty of his soldiers and the respect of those who served under him. When his father finally died, it was Constantine who took up the mantle, proclaimed emperor by the legions in Britain. Word of his triumph reached Helena in her later years, carried by travelers and merchants who spoke with awe of the young ruler who bore her name. She listened, her eyes filling with tears, not of vanity, but of gratitude. The boy she had raised in exile was now a man commanding the might of Rome. And yet she knew that his greatest victory still lay ahead, not on the battlefield, but in the soul. Helena's heart often turned in prayer toward the unseen workings of God. She could not have known that her son's path would be illuminated by a vision that would change the course of history. But perhaps, in the silence of her prayers, she sensed it. There are mothers who know when their children are chosen for something greater than themselves. She prayed not for his worldly success, but that he would learn mercy, that he would remember the cross she had once held before him when he was a child, frightened of the dark. "Light will come," she had said then. "Always remember, the sign of the cross is stronger than any sword." And indeed, light would come. Years later, as Constantine prepared to face his rivals for power, a strange phenomenon appeared in the sky, a cross of light shining above the sun with the words, "In this sign, conquer." The vision struck him to the core. He ordered the symbol of the cross to be painted on his soldiers' shields and banners. They marched to victory beneath its sign, and Constantine's triumph became the dawn of a new age for the Christian faith. From the quiet prayers of a forgotten woman had sprung the faith of an empire. Helena's unseen devotion had become the spiritual seed of renewal for a world weary of idols and wars. When news of Constantine's conversion reached her, Helena felt her heart tremble. She who had once been cast aside now saw God's justice in full bloom. The empire that had spurned her had bowed before the sign of her Redeemer. She knelt in thanksgiving, whispering the same words she had spoken countless times in obscurity. "Thy will be done." It was not triumph she felt, but peace, the deep, enduring peace that comes when pain has fulfilled its purpose. Yet even in her joy, she remained humble. She did not seek recognition or wealth. When Constantine sent for her to join him, offering her the title of Augusta, she accepted it with grace, but wore it lightly. Her robes were finer, her attendants numerous, yet her eyes still turned toward the poor, the sick, the forgotten. She knew that honor means little if it is not placed at the service of love. The Empress of Rome walked among beggars and widows, speaking to them not as ruler but as sister. Her palace became a refuge for the broken, her hands the instruments of quiet mercy. And still, in her solitude, she remembered the years of rejection, the tavern, the exile, the loneliness. But now those memories no longer hurt. They glowed like embers of grace. Without them, she thought, she might never have learned compassion, never have understood the sorrows of the world. She saw her life now as a pattern woven by divine hands, each loss a thread of light in the great design. Her son's empire might stretch across continents, but Helena's kingdom was of another kind, the realm of faith, born from endurance, crowned with humility. The years of waiting, of humiliation and silence, had not been wasted. They had ripened her soul for the task that was yet to come, the search that would define her sainthood and alter the devotion of centuries. For deep within her, she felt a new stirring, a call that came not from court or command, but from the heart of God himself. It would lead her far from Rome, across deserts and seas, to a land where suffering and salvation once met upon a hill. But for now, she rested in gratitude, watching her son rule with strength and favor, whispering prayers of thanksgiving for the mysterious ways of grace. The cradle of joy often rocks beside the cross of loss. The grandeur of Rome had risen like a dream, its marble gleaming under the sun, its legions sweeping across the known world. Yet amid that glittering expanse of empire, there existed one heart that had learned to measure glory not in gold, but in grace. Helena, now Augusta, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, had ascended to the height of honor, yet she remained inwardly untouched by its splendor. Her son's throne was cast in power, but her own throne was carved from faith. Every jewel upon her robe, every bow before her presence, reminded her of the distance she had traveled, from the dim tavern of Drepanum to the luminous halls of imperial Rome. She had walked a road paved with rejection and sorrow, and through it, her soul had been refined into something unbreakable. Yet even as the empire rejoiced in peace and her son's reign flourished, Helena carried within her a quiet awareness. The higher the world lifts a soul, the closer it must cling to humility if it is to remain whole. She was now past her middle years, her hair streaked with silver, her face serene but marked with lines carved by time and prayer. In the mornings, she would rise before the court stirred, retreating to her private chapel where the cross stood plain and unadorned. It was not the jeweled symbol of victory that now fluttered upon Constantine's banners. It was a simple wooden cross, carved roughly by a local craftsman. There, before that image, Helena would kneel and pray with the same fervor she had known in her days of exile. She prayed for her son's wisdom, for the strength of his newfound faith, for the soul of the man who had once cast her aside, and for the people of the empire, millions of souls still groping in the shadows of forgotten gods. And in that dim chamber, amid the flicker of oil lamps, she found her purpose deepening, like roots pressing into the soil of grace. The palace around her was filled with life, servants hurrying through corridors, senators whispering of policy, generals speaking of campaigns. Helena moved among them with a calm that disarmed even the most hardened courtiers. She had no interest in politics, though she was wise enough to understand them. What she sought was not control, but conversion, of hearts, of spirits, of the unseen world within every man and woman. Her presence alone became a kind of gentle sermon. She walked through the markets in disguise to speak with the poor, visited the sick in secret, and offered alms with her own hands. Word spread quietly through the city that the Empress herself had been seen washing the feet of beggars. Some scoffed, others were moved. Constantine, though absorbed in the duties of empire, knew of his mother's works and loved her more deeply for them. Yet even amid the reverence surrounding her, Helena remained haunted by a subtle restlessness. She felt within her spirit a yearning that no earthly honor could satisfy, a call that seemed to echo from the very heart of her prayers. It was as though the cross, which her son had seen in vision and which now crowned every victory, was summoning her to something more. She began to dream often of a land far away, a land she had never seen but had long imagined when reading the stories of the Gospels, the rugged hills of Judea, the streets of Jerusalem, the place where the Savior had suffered and risen. The dreams grew vivid until one night she awoke in tears, convinced that God was asking her to go there. She told no one at first, afraid that the court would see it as folly, but the desire did not fade. It grew stronger each day, like the quiet pull of the tide that cannot be resisted. When at last she spoke to Constantine, she found him surprisingly receptive. He had come to see faith not as weakness, but as strength. And though he ruled an empire, he had learned to revere the God who had given him victory. "Go, mother," he said gently, "and see the land that gave birth to our salvation. Let your steps bless the soil where the Redeemer walked." He offered her every resource, ships, guards, and treasures for her journey, but Helena asked only for what was necessary. "I will go as a pilgrim," she said, "not as a queen." Her humility moved even the hardened soldiers who were chosen to accompany her. The Empress of the Roman world would set forth like a simple traveler, seeking not conquest, but truth. Before leaving, Helena visited the poor once more, distributing food, clothing, and coins. To those who asked where she was going, she replied softly, "To find the memory of our Lord." Her ship departed from the port as dawn broke, the sea catching the light in rippling gold. Those who watched her sail away saw not the grandeur of an empress, but the quiet majesty of faith in motion. The waves carried her toward a destiny no crown could bestow. The journey was long and often harsh. The sea turned violent, the winds screamed, and the soldiers feared for their lives. But Helena stood firm, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He who stilled the storm," she reminded them, "still commands the sea." Her calm steadied them, and when the winds at last subsided, they reached the shores of the Holy Land. As her feet touched the soil of Palestine, she felt an almost electric stillness, as though every stone beneath her sandals remembered the footsteps of Christ. She fell to her knees, weeping silently, overwhelmed by a sense of returning home to a place she had never known. The people of Jerusalem greeted her with reverence. The city was weary, scarred by time and conquest, but within its ruins, faith still breathed. The local Christians received her as both queen and sister, astonished that the mother of the emperor had come not to command, but to pray. Helena walked among them without ceremony, visiting the places where Jesus had suffered, died, and risen. At each site, she knelt in silence, pressing her hand to the earth, whispering words of thanksgiving. Yet one thought consumed her: the cross. the very wood upon which her Savior had been crucified. Was it still there, buried beneath centuries of dust and desecration? Could the relic of salvation still be found? The thought would not leave her, and soon her pilgrimage became a mission. Under her direction, workers began to dig near Golgotha, guided by the faint memories preserved by the faithful. The task was immense. The earth yielded stones, bones, and the remains of ancient shrines. Days stretched into weeks, and many despaired. But Helena would not abandon the search. Each morning she arrived at the site before dawn, praying as the laborers worked. "Lord," she whispered, "you who revealed yourself in weakness, reveal now the sign of your love." Her persistence was not born of superstition, but of devotion. For her, finding the cross was not about relics or relic worship. It was about remembering the reality of redemption, the physical touch of God's sacrifice. As she watched the dust rise under the blows of pick and shovel, Helena thought of her own life, the tavern, the shame, the loneliness. How strange that she, who had once been cast aside, now sought the very symbol of rejection and triumph combined. Perhaps that was why she could not give up. For in the story of the cross, she saw her own. The world crowns its rulers. God crowns his seekers. The sun burned white above the hills of Jerusalem, and the air shimmered with dust and prayer. Helena stood at the edge of the excavation, the scent of earth and sweat mingling with incense. Weeks had become months, and still the men dug. Beneath layers of rock and rubble, centuries of conquest lay entombed. The ruins of temples, the foundations of pagan shrines, the bones of forgotten martyrs. But Helena would not leave. Each dawn she rose from her bed with the same resolve, walking barefoot to the site as the city stirred awake. The people whispered that she was a woman possessed, but she knew otherwise. She was a woman called. The cross had once lifted the weight of the world, and she would not rest until she found the wood that bore that love. Her strength surprised those who served her. She was no longer young. Her hands trembled when she held her staff. Her breathing came slowly, yet her spirit was fierce. "Dig deeper," she would say quietly, her voice soft but certain, and they obeyed, moved by the strange authority that comes only from faith. Jerusalem itself seemed to resist her search. The earth yielded fragments of idols, remnants of Roman altars built upon the sacred place of crucifixion. Emperor Hadrian had long ago sought to erase the memory of Christ, building a temple to Venus atop Golgotha. The irony was bitter, but Helena saw in it the pattern of divine irony, that what men bury, God raises again. One morning, as the sun rose red behind the Mount of Olives, a worker cried out. Beneath the last layer of stone lay a hollow, and within it, the faint glint of old wood. Helena's heart stopped. The men cleared the debris carefully, and before long they uncovered not one cross, but 3, weathered, ancient, and indistinguishable from one another. The excitement of discovery quickly turned to doubt. Which of these, if any, was the true cross of Christ? Helena's joy faltered, but her faith did not. "If this be his cross," she whispered, "he will make it known." A bishop of Jerusalem, Macarius, stood beside her, his hands folded in reverence. He suggested that the answer must come from God, not from speculation. Together they prayed beside the relics, and Helena wept silently, her tears falling upon the wood. To test the crosses, they brought forth a dying woman from the city, a poor soul near her final breath. The first cross was placed upon her, but nothing changed. The second followed, and still the silence of death lingered. Then, as the third cross touched her skin, the woman stirred, gasping for air. Her eyes opened, life flooding back into her. The crowd fell to its knees, cries of awe echoing through the narrow streets. Helena covered her face and wept again. But this time her tears were those of pure thanksgiving. She had found it, the true cross, the very instrument of salvation. For a long while, no one moved. Even the workers, hardened by labor, stood trembling, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or the beginning of eternity itself. Helena lifted her gaze towards the hill, where centuries earlier her Lord had hung between heaven and earth. She could almost hear his words again. "Father, forgive them." Now the forgiveness had become tangible, resting in her hands. She kissed the wood gently, her lips trembling. In that moment, she felt her own life flash before her. The tavern in Drepanum, the humiliation of abandonment, the long years of silence. Every wound she had endured seemed to find its answer in that simple piece of wood. The cross, once a symbol of disgrace, had become the throne of divine mercy. And she, a woman once scorned, had been chosen to bring it to light. She whispered, "O Lord, you have turned my shame into your glory." News of the discovery spread like wildfire through Jerusalem. Pilgrims and priests came in waves to see the holy relic, to touch the mystery that connected heaven to earth. Constantine, upon hearing his mother's message, ordered that churches be built on the sacred sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over the tomb, and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. He decreed that the empire should remember forever what his mother had found. Helena oversaw the construction with tireless devotion, her faith animating every stone laid by weary hands. She spoke not as an empress, but as a servant of the cross, reminding those who worked that each act of labor was itself an offering. "We build not for glory," she told them, "but for remembrance." In the months that followed, Helena divided her time between prayer and service. She ordered that one portion of the cross remain in Jerusalem as a sign to the faithful, and another to be sent to Constantine in Rome. She crafted a silver reliquary for it herself, her fingers tracing its design as though in communion with its purpose. Yet she kept a small fragment for her own devotion, a reminder that the cross was not merely wood, but the presence of love itself. Her humility deepened even as her fame grew. People sought her blessings, believing that her touch carried healing, but she always deflected their praise. "It is not I who give," she would say gently. "It is he who gave all." Her pilgrimage, though crowned with triumph, was not without pain. The harsh climate, the long hours, and her advanced age took their toll. Still, she refused rest. She traveled to Bethlehem to visit the cave where Christ was born, and there, kneeling upon the stone floor, she felt the circle of her journey closing. She had sought the cross, but in truth, it had been seeking her all along. Every hardship she had endured, the poverty of youth, the rejection, the loneliness, had prepared her to understand the mystery of the crucified one. She realized that to find the cross was not merely to uncover it in the earth, but to recognize it in her own heart, carried unseen through every season of her life. In her final days in the Holy Land, Helena walked barefoot through the streets, blessing the people who came to see her. She visited prisons and leper colonies, distributing alms with her own hands. "I have seen the place of his suffering," she said to one of the prisoners, "and now I understand that suffering can be holy." Those who heard her words felt their burdens lighten. She moved among them like a mother, her tenderness undimmed by her title. Even the soldiers who guarded her found themselves changed by her example. One later said, "She ruled without a crown and conquered without a sword." When at last her work was done, she prepared to return to Rome, her mission fulfilled. As she boarded the ship, she looked once more toward Jerusalem. The air shimmered in the distance, and she thought she could almost see the cross rising above the hills, bathed in light. She smiled faintly, her heart at peace. "It is found," she whispered, "and it shall never be lost again." The sea carried her away, but her spirit remained woven into the fabric of that sacred land, like a prayer without end. From the dust of death, the sign of life emerges eternal. The voyage home was long and tranquil, the waves gentle beneath a sky that seemed wider than she had ever known. Helena stood often at the ship's edge, her hands resting upon the worn rail, her eyes fixed on the horizon where sea and heaven met in endless blue. Around her, sailors worked quietly, their rough manners softened by reverence. They had watched her kneel in prayer each morning, her lips moving in gratitude rather than command. The winds favored her return, and even the sea appeared to bear her gently, as though aware that it carried not only an empress, but the bearer of the world's holiest memory. Within her cabin lay the reliquary, small, gleaming and heavy with the fragment of the true cross that she had kept for her son. Sometimes, at night, she would open the chest and simply look upon it, the candlelight trembling over the silver. She did not touch it often, for even gazing upon it filled her with awe too deep for words. Each night she prayed for Constantine. She remembered his boyhood laughter, the way his hand had fit in hers as they walked the dusty roads of their exile. She had long ceased to think of him as her triumph. He was now her offering. Her son ruled an empire, but she prayed that he would learn to rule his heart. She whispered into the darkness, "Lord, let him be not only emperor of men, but servant of your cross." Sometimes she thought she could still hear his voice as a child, repeating the prayers she had taught him. These memories gave her more comfort than any throne could offer. As the coast of Italy came into view, Helena felt both joy and weariness. Rome awaited her return, but she knew she would never again see it as she once had. The city of marble and triumphs was no longer her home. Her heart now belonged to the hills of Jerusalem, where faith breathed through dust and silence. When she entered the imperial capital, the people gathered in great crowds, their cheers echoing through the streets. Word of her discovery had already spread throughout the empire. They called her Mother of the Cross, and her name was spoken with reverence. Constantine himself came to greet her, descending from his carriage with the same humility she had once taught him. He embraced her before all the people, and for a moment the noise of the world faded away. "Mother," he said, his voice trembling, "you have given the empire more than peace. You have given it faith." Helena smiled, her eyes glistening. "It was never mine to give," she answered. "It was always his to reveal." In the months that followed, Constantine built churches across the empire, dedicating them to the memory of the cross. Helena guided his zeal with wisdom, reminding him that faith is not built upon stone alone, but upon the conversion of hearts. She moved quietly through the palaces, visiting chapels, instructing servants, and continuing her works of mercy. Her presence became a blessing wherever she walked. Senators bowed before her, but she greeted them as equals. Widows came to her doors, and she fed them with her own hands. Children followed her in the streets, laughing and clutching at her robes, and she would stoop to bless them, tracing the sign of the cross upon their foreheads. "Never forget," she would whisper, "that love makes all things new." Yet Helena's body began to yield to time. The long years of travel, fasting, and prayer had left her frail. Her steps grew slower, and the courtiers noticed the tremor in her hands. But she did not fear her weakness. She welcomed it as a sign that her journey was nearing its sacred end. Each morning she rose to pray, as she had always done, her eyes closed in quiet surrender. "You have shown me, Lord," she would murmur, "the wood that bore you. Show me now the way that leads to you." Her attendants wept to see her fading, but she smiled at their sorrow. "Do not grieve," she told them gently. "The cross was once a tree of death, and now it is the gate of life. So it shall be for me." One evening, as the sun descended over the Tiber, she asked to be taken to a small chapel near her residence. The air was filled with the scent of incense and the faint hum of distant bells. She knelt before the altar, the light of the setting sun spilling through the window, bathing her in a soft, golden glow. Before her stood the reliquary containing the fragment of the true cross. She touched it lightly, her fingers trembling, and whispered, "At last, I have touched heaven's sorrow and found in it heaven's joy." For a long while, she remained there in silence, her mind returning to the tavern of Drepanum, to the laughter of soldiers, to the quiet humility of her youth. How far she had traveled, and yet she thought she had never really left that small place of service. She had simply carried it into the courts of emperors. That night, she dreamt of Jerusalem again, the same dream that had haunted and blessed her since her pilgrimage. She saw herself walking through the streets, barefoot, the cross shining above the hill. Around her, people sang softly, their voices blending with the wind. When she awoke, her face was wet with tears. She called for Constantine, and when he arrived, she took his hand. "My son," she said softly, "remember always that it was not the sword that conquered, but the sign of the cross. Rule your people in its shadow, not its pride." He bowed his head, unable to speak. "You have taught me everything," he managed to whisper. "No," she answered. "I have only reminded you of what God already wrote upon your heart." In her final days, Helena asked that the poor be allowed to enter her chamber freely. They came in small groups, women, beggars, children, each seeking a blessing. She spoke little, but her presence alone seemed to bring them peace. To one trembling woman she said, "Do not fear suffering. It is the door through which love enters." To a young man who had lost his faith, she said, "Search for him in your pain, and you will find that he was there first." Her words lingered in their hearts, like the afterglow of evening light. When her time came, she faced it as she had faced every trial, with calm faith and open hands. The priests gathered around her bed, chanting softly. Constantine knelt beside her, his tears falling upon her wrinkled fingers. Helena turned her gaze toward the small cross that hung above her bed. Her lips moved, barely audible. "Into your hands, Lord." The air grew still. For a moment, it seemed as though all of Rome held its breath. Then her eyes closed, her face serene, her spirit released like a whisper returning to its source. Outside, the bells tolled slowly, their sound drifting across the city like a prayer. Word spread that the Empress had passed into eternity. The people wept openly, not with despair, but with reverent sorrow. They spoke of her not as a ruler, but as a saint, the woman who had found the cross and taught the empire to believe again. Constantine ordered that her body be placed in a marble sarcophagus, adorned not with imperial symbols, but with simple carvings of vines and doves, signs of life and peace. The fragment of the true cross lay upon her chest as she was carried to rest. Helena had walked through humiliation, exile, and glory, but in the end, her journey was not toward power or recognition. It was toward the cross itself, that sacred meeting place of pain and redemption. Her life had been its reflection. Suffering transfigured into grace, weakness turned into triumph. And as the people prayed beside her tomb, they felt not sorrow, but the quiet certainty that she still walked with them, guiding the faithful toward the same light she had followed. The soul that has seen Calvary no longer fears death. The years after Helena's passing unfolded like the echo of a hymn, the melody of her life lingering long after her voice had fallen silent. Constantine, the son she had raised in obscurity, now stood as the supreme ruler of the known world. The empire stretched farther than any before him, and yet he carried within his heart a devotion that no crown could tarnish. His mother's words remained with him. The cross conquers not through pride, but through love. He repeated them often to those who gathered in his court, and he sought to shape his reign upon that sacred truth. But Rome, for all its splendor, was a restless city, a place forever haunted by its own ambition. It had known countless emperors, but none had guided it with the quiet wisdom of a woman who had once swept the floors of a tavern. Helena's legacy grew not through decrees or monuments, but through the quiet reverence of the faithful. Pilgrims began to visit her tomb, whispering prayers for courage, for healing, for peace. Many claimed miracles at her resting place. Blind eyes opened, the sick found strength, the desolate discovered hope. The stories spread like ripples through the empire, and before long, the name of Saint Helena was spoken in the same breath as those of the apostles she had loved. Churches were built in her honor, not to celebrate her royalty, but to enshrine her faith. Artists painted her with the cross in her hands, her eyes lifted toward heaven, the expression of one who had gazed upon both sorrow and glory, and found them one and the same. Constantine himself felt her presence often. He would retreat to his private chapel and stand before the fragment of the true cross she had brought him, remembering how she had kissed it with trembling lips. The power of the relic was not in its wood, but in the story it bore. The story of a mother who had found redemption in the same sign that once marked her shame. In those moments, the emperor who had conquered armies knelt like a child, murmuring the prayers she had taught him long ago. The empire bowed to his rule, but he bowed to the cross, and in that act, Helena's mission was fulfilled once more. Time moved on, as time must, and the centuries began to blur the details of her life. Yet her image endured, carried by the faith she had rekindled. When the early church fathers spoke of her, they spoke with tenderness. They saw in her a living parable, the outcast made instrument of God's revelation, the humble heart that found the world's holiest treasure. St. Ambrose would one day write that she found the cross not by royal command, but by faith alone, and that she lifted it not as a relic, but as the proof that God dwells among the lowly. In every word written about her, one could hear the same refrain: holiness is born in humility. As the empire aged and faltered, the memory of Helena became a source of strength for those who endured its storms. When new rulers rose and fell, her story remained a quiet lamp in the darkness. Pilgrims continued to journey to Jerusalem, where she had uncovered the true cross. They knelt before the great church of the Holy Sepulchre that her son had built, and they felt her spirit in the stone, in the air thick with incense, in the flicker of lamps burning beside the relic she had restored to the world. Some said that on quiet evenings, as the candles flickered low, one could almost sense a presence moving through the church. A gentlewoman in a simple robe, her steps light, her gaze serene, still tending to the mystery she had unearthed. In the East, her name became a hymn. The Byzantine world called her Isapostolos, equal to the apostles, for she had done what few others dared. She had bridged the world of Caesar and the world of Christ. Her example became a mirror for queens and mothers, for widows and seekers. They saw in her not the untouchable perfection of a distant saint, but the strength of one who had lived as they lived, poor, abandoned, tested, and transfigured. Even centuries later, when empires collapsed and faith was persecuted, women whispered her name in prayer. "Saint Helena," they would murmur, "help me find what is lost." And she did, not through thunder or vision, but through quiet intercession, guiding hearts back to the cross she once found beneath the earth. In Rome, her relics were honored in solemn procession. The faithful lined the streets, holding candles that trembled like living stars in the evening air. Her sarcophagus, carved with images of vines and doves, was borne through the city she had once entered in triumph. The people did not shout, they sang. Their hymn was slow and steady, rising like incense, crux fidelis, inter omnes, the faithful cross. The empire had changed. Its borders had shifted. Its gods had fallen. But one thing endured: the cross she had lifted high, and the memory of the woman who had believed it could still be found. In the centuries that followed, her story continued to inspire new generations. When crusaders set out for the Holy Land, they carried her image upon their banners. When pilgrims walked barefoot across deserts, they prayed to her for protection. Even in faraway lands that had never known Rome's rule, her legend traveled. Her life became a symbol not merely of discovery, but of redemption. The truth that no one is too lost, too lowly, or too broken to be chosen by God. Artists and poets retold her story. The barmaid who became empress, the empress who became pilgrim, the pilgrim who became saint. And always, at the center of every retelling, stood the cross, gleaming with the light of her faith. It is said that when the relic of the true cross was once more threatened by war, a vision appeared to a monk who guarded it. In his dream, Helena stood beside him, calm and radiant, her hand upon the relic. "Fear not," she said. "What is of God cannot be lost." The monk awoke to find the relic safe, untouched by the flames that had devoured the chapel around it. Whether legend or truth, the story endured, for it carried the essence of her spirit. The steadfast trust that divine love, once found, can never truly be buried again. And so her name remains, carried through the prayers of centuries. Saint Helena, the finder of the true cross, the mother of Constantine, the empress who knelt in the dust of Jerusalem. Her feast is celebrated with quiet reverence, her memory invoked by those who seek lost faith, lost purpose, lost hope. For her life, more than any relic, is proof that holiness is not born from privilege, but from perseverance. She found the cross because she first carried it, unseen, through every sorrow that shaped her heart. Even now, when pilgrims stand before her relics, whether in Rome, in Constantinople, or in the quiet chapels that bear her name, they find themselves hushed by her story. They see not the grandeur of empire, but the tenderness of grace. The flicker of candlelight upon marble seems to whisper her journey, from barmaid to empress, from shame to sainthood, from the dust of rejection to the radiance of redemption. And perhaps, in that silence, she still speaks, softly, as she once did to her son. The cross is not the end, but the beginning. Perhaps this is why her legacy endures, because every believer who has felt forgotten, every heart that has been cast aside, finds in her a mirror of divine mercy. She reminds the weary that God's gaze does not rest upon the thrones of the mighty, but upon the souls who love in silence. Her story remains a beacon for all who search for meaning in their pain, proof that the greatest treasures are often found beneath the weight of the world. And somewhere, in the quiet hours of prayer, when the light dims and hearts turn toward heaven, One may still feel her near, the saint who searched until she found the cross, and in finding it, taught the world that love is never lost. Death cannot claim what has already been given to eternity. The centuries rolled onward, as empires crumbled and faith endured, and yet the figure of Saint Helena remained, luminous and steadfast, like a candle that refused to flicker in the storm of history. The memory of her life had become a thread, woven into the Church's tapestry, a reminder that sanctity is not the privilege of the mighty, but the destiny of the faithful. In distant lands where her name had never been spoken, the cross, she found, had already gone before her, carried by missionaries and pilgrims who invoked her as their unseen companion. Her discovery had become more than a relic. It was a story, a parable, a quiet revolution that continued to shape the soul of Christendom. It was said that in the generations after her passing, the relic of the true cross traveled like a heartbeat through the veins of the empire. Pieces of it were enshrined in basilicas, encased in jeweled reliquaries, lifted high during processions that brought tears to the eyes of the faithful. People who had never seen Jerusalem would kneel before the cross and whisper her name, remembering the woman who had once stood beneath the blazing sun of Golgotha, searching not for glory, but for truth. Helena's pilgrimage had never truly ended. It had become the Church's own. The roads she once walked had turned into paths of devotion, her footsteps echoed by millions who would come after her. In Constantinople, the city her son had founded, her memory was venerated with solemn beauty. Each spring, the faithful gathered to celebrate the Feast of the Cross, their hymns rising like incense through the great domes of Hagia Sophia. The patriarch would lift the relic high, and the people would bow low, their foreheads touching the marble floor. In that sacred act, time itself seemed to dissolve, and Helena was once more among them, her wrinkled hands clasped in prayer, her gaze steady and tender. She had become not only a saint, but a symbol of the Church's maternal heart, a reminder that love, when purified by suffering, becomes eternal. In the West, her image adorned the walls of churches and monasteries. Artists painted her holding the cross, her garments of imperial red softened by the humility of her expression. Poets wrote of her as the Queen of Pilgrims, and mothers invoked her intercession for their children. Even the scholars of later centuries, steeped in reason and doubt, found themselves moved by her story. For who could deny the power of a woman who, though abandoned by her husband and forgotten by the world, had uncovered the very wood upon which the world's salvation hung? Her tale transcended creed and century. It spoke to the heart's deepest longing, that from pain may rise redemption, from humiliation holiness, from loss a love that never dies. Through the ages, pilgrims continued to journey to the Holy Land, following the paths Helena once trod. They came from distant kingdoms, from monasteries hidden in mountains, from fishing villages along the cold northern seas. They crossed deserts and seas, guided by faith and by her invisible hand. Many carried small crosses of olive wood, carved in imitation of the one she had found. Some came seeking healing, others forgiveness. All came seeking meaning. And when they stood before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built by her command, they felt that their journey wasn't theirs alone. It was hers, too. The stones beneath their feet seemed to whisper her name, the same way the earth once whispered to her as she searched for the relic that would change the world. Even kings and emperors bowed to her example. In times of war, they sought to carry a fragment of the true cross into battle, believing that its presence would shield them from harm. Some did so with faith, others with superstition, yet the cross never ceased to remind them of her, the woman who had found it not with armies, but with tears. Her legacy became a measure of devotion. The mightiest ruler could not outshine the humility of Saint Helena, and the proudest empire could not surpass the power of her prayer. She had redefined what it meant to be noble, teaching that the truest nobility is to kneel. In later centuries, her name crossed beyond Christendom. Historians of far-off lands wrote of her as the Empress who found the Tree of Life. Pilgrims from the East brought tales of her gentleness to lands that knew nothing of Rome. Even those who did not share her faith found in her story a certain peace, the peace of a soul that had transformed pain into purpose. Her discovery of the cross became a universal metaphor, that the sacred lies buried beneath the weight of the world, waiting to be uncovered by faith. There were times when the relics she had uncovered were threatened, by war, by greed, by the passing of centuries. Armies plundered Jerusalem, empires rose and fell, yet somehow, always, the cross endured. Some said it was protected by angels. Others whispered that Helena herself still guarded it from beyond the veil. Monks spoke of seeing her in visions, standing beside the altar with a lantern in her hand, her face serene, her eyes filled with the same light that had guided her through life. Whether these were dreams or revelations, no one could say. But all agreed that her spirit had never truly left the world she loved. As the church grew and divided, her figure remained a bridge. Catholics and Orthodox alike revered her, and even amid the wounds of separation, her memory united them in reverence for the cross. Her name was spoken in Latin and Greek alike, her feast celebrated by both East and West. Perhaps it was fitting, for Helena herself had lived between worlds, the lowly and the royal, the human and the divine. She was the thread that bound opposites together, proving that God's grace flows not through boundaries, but through hearts willing to be broken and remade. In the quiet of monasteries, her story became a meditation for those who sought God in silence. Monks spoke of her perseverance as a mirror of the spiritual life, the digging through layers of the self, the labor of patience, the discovery of the cross within one's own heart. For was not her search an image of every soul's journey? To uncover beneath the rubble of pride and pain the hidden Christ, waiting to be found. And when they prayed before their wooden crucifixes, they felt that they prayed not alone, but with her, the woman who had once lifted the same sign from the earth with trembling hands. Time, in its mercy, turns history into memory, and memory into prayer. So it has been with Helena. Her story is no longer just the tale of an empress who lived long ago. It is a living parable whispered through generations. Mothers teach their daughters about her courage, priests preach her faith to those who despair, and pilgrims whisper her name as they kneel before the relics she revealed. And perhaps, even now, when the candles are lit and the night is still, she kneels beside them unseen, her hand upon the cross, her lips repeating the same prayer she once spoke in the dust of Golgotha. Lord, let all who seek you find. And thus her light endures, gentle, unwavering, eternal. For Helena did not simply find the cross, she became it, its endurance, its humility, its silent power to heal and redeem. Her life remains a sermon without end, teaching each generation that love buried is never lost, that faith forgotten can yet be found, and that beneath the ruins of every sorrow lies the shape of salvation. Perhaps in the end, every soul must dig as she did, through the ruins of pride, through the stones of disappointment, through the silence of waiting, until at last it touches the wood of the cross and realizes that God had been there all along. Perhaps, in the end, every soul must become a pilgrim, seeking the hidden cross within. The memory of Saint Helena, once a living flame in the hearts of her generation, drifted gently into legend as the centuries marched onward. Yet her story did not fade. Rather, it deepened, like wine aged in the dark cellars of history. Each new era found in her a reflection of its own longing, a reminder that holiness is not a relic of the past, but a living current flowing quietly through time. The cross she unearthed had long since been divided and enshrined, scattered like seeds across the Christian world. But wherever a fragment was kept, her presence lingered beside it. In cathedrals and monasteries, her image stood radiant and still, a woman holding a beam of wood, her eyes raised heavenward, her expression serene and strong. She had become not merely a saint of discovery, but a saint of endurance, proof that grace can flourish in the most unlikely soil. As the ages darkened and the fires of faith seemed at times to flicker, the Church turned again to her memory. During the long winters of uncertainty, her life was retold by candlelight, the story of the Barmaid who became empress, the empress who became pilgrim, and the pilgrim who found the cross. Each retelling carried not just history, but hope. For those who labored under oppression or exile, she was a companion. For those who suffered disgrace or loss, she was a sister. Her example whispered that humiliation is not the end of love, but often its beginning. The world she had known, the marble and gold of Rome, the dust and ruins of Jerusalem, had long since changed, but the spirit that guided her remained unbroken. Her life was now a parable of the Church itself, battered by centuries yet still searching, still finding, still standing before the cross in awe. In the medieval monasteries of Europe, monks copied her story onto illuminated parchment, tracing her name in letters of gold. Between their prayers, they imagined her standing once more upon the hill of Golgotha, the sun descending behind her, the cross lifted in her trembling hands. They understood her not as distant royalty, but as one of their own, a soul who had learned that the only true kingdom is the one ruled by God. To them, she embodied the monastic vow of perseverance. Her years of silence before her triumph mirrored the long endurance of those who seek God in obscurity. She had dug through the soil of her life with faith as her only tool, and at the bottom she had found the treasure all hearts seek, the nearness of the divine. In the high cathedrals of Christendom, where choirs filled the vaults with unending hymns, her feast was celebrated with solemn joy. The priests would lift the relic of the cross before the congregation, its jeweled casing sparkling like a shard of heaven. And in the hush that followed, her name was spoken with tenderness. Helena, faithful mother of faith. The faithful saw in her the triumph of compassion over pride, of humility over power. The image of an aging woman crossing deserts and ruins to find a forgotten relic spoke to something eternal, the longing of the soul to touch the truth it loves. The cross she sought had become a mirror for the hearts of believers, and her pilgrimage an image of the Church's endless journey toward renewal. Her influence reached beyond the cloisters and chapels. Artists painted her in luminous frescoes, sometimes crowned as empress, sometimes barefoot as pilgrim. In each depiction, her face bore the same expression, a calm born from surrender, the peace that follows suffering accepted in love. Poets wrote verses in her honor, calling her the Mother of the Cross, the light of pilgrims, the finder of God's mercy. To the women of later centuries, queens who governed kingdoms, widows who governed households, she became a guiding star. They saw in her the sanctity of perseverance, the strength to endure betrayal and transform it into blessing. To the poor, she was proof that dignity is not given by birth, but by grace. To all who wept, she was the gentle voice that whispered, "Do not lose heart. God writes your story in invisible ink until the time comes for light to reveal it. Even as wars swept across nations and the Holy Land changed hands countless times, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre still stood, its stones worn smooth by centuries of prayer. Pilgrims came in endless waves, whispering her name as they descended the worn steps to touch the relics she had uncovered. Many felt as though she walked beside them, her hand light upon their shoulders. In that dim, incense-scented place, she had become the guardian of memory, the one who ensured that the story of salvation would never vanish into dust. Some swore that, on certain mornings when the first rays of dawn pierced the church's windows, her figure could be glimpsed in the light. A woman kneeling before the cross, her face luminous with love. The Renaissance would later rediscover her in marble and paint, but even then her essence remained the same. Artists could adorn her with crowns and silks, yet her sanctity could never be gilded. It shone best in simplicity. She had never sought fame or beauty. Both had sought her only after she had given them up. The poets of that age called her the Empress of Faith, yet she would have preferred the title Servant of the Cross. And indeed, the deeper her legend grew, the more her humility seemed to shine through it, as though even in heaven she still bowed before the mystery she had once found buried in the earth. Centuries later, when faith was challenged by reason and belief seemed to wane, her story again rose like a quiet tide. The philosophers who dismissed miracles as myth could not dismiss her humanity, the tenderness of a mother, the endurance of a woman who turned suffering into strength. Her discovery of the true cross, whether seen through the eyes of faith or history, continued to symbolize the search for what lies beneath all ruin: meaning, hope, and redemption. And so she remained beloved not only by the devout, but by the searching, those who, like her, longed to find something true beneath the world's dust. In the modern age, pilgrims still walk where she once walked. Airplanes have replaced caravans, and cameras have replaced scrolls, yet the journey is the same. They stand before the hill of Calvary, where sunlight falls on ancient stones, and they whisper her name with gratitude. They sense that she understands them still, their doubts, their sorrows, their unspoken prayers. For Helena's story is not merely a story of faith achieved, it is the story of faith pursued, faith held in trembling hands and kept alive through love. She is every soul that has ever searched for God in the ruins of its own heart and refused to give up until it found Him. Perhaps this is why her presence feels so near even now. She lived long ago, yet her spirit remains woven into every act of devotion that springs from humility. When a mother prays for her child, when a wanderer kneels in an unfamiliar land, when a sinner returns to grace, Helena's footsteps echo faintly in the distance. She is not a figure of the past, but of the eternal present, the proof that holiness is the art of remembering what the world forgets. And so, across the ages, her story continues to breathe, unhurried, unforgotten. The cross she found still stands, in stone and spirit alike, its shadow falling gently over the weary and the faithful. It tells the same truth she once lived, that love is stronger than power, faith greater than fear, and humility the path that leads all souls home. The wood of shame becomes the throne of glory. In the quiet rhythm of history, the name of Saint Helena continued to move like a gentle tide, washing over generations who never saw her face, but somehow felt her nearness. To speak her name was to whisper a prayer of endurance, a reminder that faith does not flourish in the ease of life, but in the patient waiting of those who dare to believe in the unseen. Time had scattered her relics, divided her memory across continents, but her story remained whole, unbroken, untouched by centuries. She lived on not in marble or in the dust of forgotten ruins, but in the hearts of those who sought the cross as she once did, with trembling hope and unyielding trust. In the East, her legacy shone with quiet brilliance. The great Byzantine hymns that rose from incense-filled domes called her equal to the apostles, not for her rank, but for her faith, which had accomplished what armies could not. Her image was painted in luminous icons, her face serene, her hands bearing the cross like a fragile flame that never burned out. In those golden panels, she was not an empress of conquest, but of compassion. Her eyes seemed to look not upon the glory of empire, but into the depths of human suffering. Monks and mystics who prayed before her image often said that they felt seen by her, as though she understood every hidden sorrow of the human heart. And perhaps she did. For had she not once carried within her own soul the same mixture of grief and grace that defines all who seek God? In the West, her story took root in another way. Churches rose under her patronage, simple chapels and grand cathedrals alike, and each bore the same symbol upon its altar, the cross. Pilgrims traveling through Europe found her name on roadside shrines, etched into stone by hands long turned to dust. Her feast day was celebrated with quiet processions. Priests carried wooden crosses through the streets, blessing the people with the same sign she had lifted from the earth. For many, she became a bridge between the ancient world and their own. A woman of flesh and tears who had reached across the centuries to remind them that sanctity is always possible, even for those who begin in lowliness. Her story was retold to children at the hearth, to soldiers before battle, to the sick upon their beds. Each retelling softened the roughness of time, polishing her memory until it gleamed with the tenderness of legend. Yet beneath all the reverence, her humanity remained vivid. She was remembered not as a distant saint of miracles, but as a mother, a woman who had known rejection and sorrow, and had turned them into instruments of grace. When the poor prayed to her, they felt they were speaking to someone who truly understood them. When the powerful invoked her name, they were reminded that even empires bow before the mystery of faith. And so, across lands and languages, her presence became both comfort and conscience, a gentle reminder that love without humility is hollow, and faith without mercy is blind. There were moments in history when the cross itself seemed to vanish again, hidden beneath wars and divisions, buried under pride or indifference. Yet each time it was rediscovered, it was as if Helena herself was there once more, standing quietly beside the place of revelation, her hands folded in gratitude. During the Crusades, knights swore oaths before the relic she had found, carrying banners marked with the sign of salvation. Though many would misunderstand its meaning, though violence would stain the symbol she had loved, there were still those among them who remembered her true message, that the cross is not a weapon, but a witness. Even amid the clamor of conquest, some carried within them her spirit of devotion, seeing in her example not triumph over others, but surrender to God. As centuries turned to millennia, her story moved beyond the boundaries of Christendom. Historians wrote of her with admiration, artists found inspiration in her courage, and scholars marveled at the depth of her legacy. Even those who doubted miracles could not doubt the miracle of her perseverance, a woman of no renown who shaped the faith of nations. To modern eyes, her journey appeared less as a legend and more as an eternal pattern. The transformation of pain into purpose, the redemption of what the world had cast aside. Her search for the cross had become a metaphor for humanity's endless search for meaning, a reminder that truth often lies hidden beneath the weight of the ordinary. In the Holy Land, where she had walked centuries before, her name was still spoken in the murmured prayers of pilgrims. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stood as both her monument and her echo, its stones darkened by smoke and centuries, its silence broken only by the whisper of prayer. Those who entered its shadow felt the pull of time dissolve. It was as though Helena's footsteps still lingered there, mingling with the sighs of countless souls who had come after her. The lamps burned dimly before the relic of the cross, and in their flickering light, her presence was felt, a soft reminder that the light of faith, however small, never truly dies. In Rome, too, her spirit lingered. The city that had once humiliated her now venerated her as one of its greatest daughters. Her relics were kept in the Church of Santa Croce in Gerusalemme, a sanctuary she herself had founded to house the sacred wood she brought from Jerusalem. There, pilgrims from every age have knelt before the same relics, tracing the sign of the cross upon their brows, whispering prayers of gratitude. Many said that the air within the church felt different, gentler, more solemn, as if the walls themselves remembered her tears and her triumph. Every spring, when the sunlight streamed through the stained glass, illuminating the relics in a soft, golden glow, one could almost believe that the Empress herself stood there still, her spirit keeping vigil beside the symbol she had once cradled in her hands. Her name continues to carry a certain quiet power, even in a world that has grown impatient with saints. To those who live in exile, exile of body, of heart, of faith, Helena remains a companion on the road. She teaches not through miracles of thunder, but through the miracle of steadfastness. Her story reminds every soul that the divine is never far from the broken, that God's grace begins where human strength ends. She has become, in the deepest sense, the saint of seekers, the guardian of those who dig through the rubble of life to find again the hidden truth of love. And perhaps that is the final mystery of her legacy, that she never really left us. She is not only a figure in marble, nor a name in liturgy, nor a story preserved in ancient pages. She is the pulse of every faithful heart that keeps searching when all seems lost. She is the whisper in the soul that says, "Dig deeper. The cross is still there." For the cross she found wasn't meant to rest forever in a reliquary. It was meant to rise again in the life of every believer who dares to love through pain and to hope through loss. And so her story continues, unbroken by time, untarnished by the centuries. In every generation there are new Helens, quiet souls who, in their own hidden ways, find again what the world forgets. Her life remains the pattern of grace, that humility is stronger than power, that patience conquers despair, and that what is buried by the world can be raised again by faith. And perhaps, when all history has passed away, and only light remains, she will still be there, standing beside the cross she once uncovered, her hands open in welcome, her eyes reflecting the mercy of the one she loved above all. The soul that has found the cross walks forever in its light. Through the slow, unhurried current of time, the legacy of St. Helena became something more than history. It became breath and pulse, a spirit that passed through generations as quietly as prayer through a cloister. The empires she had known had long fallen into dust, their marble shattered, their banners forgotten, yet her memory endured like the murmur of a psalm that never fades. Across centuries, her name remained a steady light, reminding each age that sanctity is not born of conquest or birthright, but of the hidden courage to hope when the world forgets hope. She had found the cross, yes, but perhaps more profoundly, she had shown humanity where to look for it, not only in Jerusalem's stones, but in the humble heart that keeps faith through sorrow. In every corner of the Christian world, her story continued to breathe. In the East, monks still sang hymns in her honor, the scent of incense curling through the air like a memory of her pilgrimage. Icons depicted her in stillness and majesty, one hand holding the cross, the other lifted gently toward heaven, as though in blessing. Her face in these sacred paintings was both serene and sorrowful, the serenity of peace won through pain, the sorrow of compassion for those who still wander. The Orthodox liturgy called her the most faithful pilgrim, the one who carried within her all who would seek the face of Christ. In monasteries built upon hillsides that she herself might once have walked, the monks spoke of her not as a distant saint, but as a fellow traveler, a mother of perseverance who still guided the weary to the well of grace. In the West, her name was carved into stone and sung in Latin verse. Pilgrims walking the Camino de Santiago whispered prayers to her as they passed chapels bearing her likeness. The poor loved her for her humility, the learned for her wisdom, and the broken-hearted for her endurance. Even the skeptical, those who doubted relics and miracles, found themselves moved by her quiet faith. There was something undeniably human in her story. This woman who had been cast aside, who could have grown bitter, and yet had chosen to seek the very sign of divine forgiveness. Her life was proof that grace is not given to the perfect, but to those who keep walking when the road seems empty. The Church remembered her each year with reverent joy. Bells rang in her honor, processions wound through narrow streets, priests holding crosses aloft beneath the weight of gold-threaded banners. In cathedrals where her relics rested, the faithful came to kneel and to weep, not out of sorrow, but out of recognition. They saw in her their own stories, their own losses, their own hopes redeemed by perseverance. Her story was theirs, retold in the rhythm of liturgy, where history and faith become one heartbeat. And as candles flickered before her image, her name was spoken not merely as a memory, but as a prayer. Sancta Helena, ora pro nobis. It was said that in the stillness before dawn, when the streets of Rome were empty, one could almost hear the echo of her footsteps along the marble halls of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, the church she had built from the soil of Calvary itself. She had brought earth from Jerusalem to Rome, so that even in the heart of empire there would be a corner of the Holy Land. That soil still lay there, centuries later, and pilgrims who knelt upon it swore they could feel the presence of the hill she had uncovered. For Helena, Jerusalem had not been a distant place. She had carried it within her, and through her it came to dwell in the heart of the world. But her legacy was not confined to relics or holy ground. It lived in the transformation of how the faithful understood holiness. Before her, the image of sanctity had often been of martyrs and prophets, of those who died for the faith. After her, holiness came to mean something broader and deeper. The sanctity of perseverance, of humility, of devotion lived through ordinary life. She was not a martyr, nor a scholar, nor a mystic in visions. She was a mother, a seeker, a woman of endurance. And through her, countless others learned that their suffering too could be transfigured into light. Her discovery of the cross became a mirror for every soul that dares to keep faith through silence and loss. In time, her relics themselves became pilgrims, journeying from Rome to Constantinople, from east to west, crossing lands divided by politics yet united in devotion. Wherever they traveled, faith seemed to flower anew. In some towns, it was said that drought ended when her relics arrived. In others, that the sick were healed or the despairing restored to courage. Whether these were miracles or the workings of belief, it mattered little. What mattered was the change within hearts, the quiet certainty that the same God who had guided Helena still guided them. Even the scholars of later ages, those who sought to sift history from legend, found in her a figure they could not dismiss. They wrote of her as a woman of vision, a bridge between pagan antiquity and Christian renewal, one who used power not for herself, but for faith. Historians saw her as the soul of a changing world, the moment when the empire's might bowed before a carpenter's cross. The theologians, too, pondered her story, seeing in it the mystery of divine reversal, that God chooses the lowly to reveal his greatest glory. And among them, poets found inspiration. They wrote of her as one who touched the bones of earth and found them singing, as though even the stones rejoiced beneath her searching hands. In later centuries, when the world once again lost its bearings, when wars returned and faith seemed to falter, her story resurfaced like an anchor in deep water. Preachers invoked her name during times of trial. Mothers named their daughters after her, praying they too would find strength in the face of sorrow. Even those who had never heard her full story could feel its echo, for her message was not confined to religion, but to the human spirit itself. To seek what is good, to dig through the dust of despair until one finds what is eternal. And so Helena lives still, not in marble nor in legend, but in every act of humble courage. Her spirit is there in the nurse who comforts the dying, in the pilgrim who walks alone beneath the stars, in the mother who prays for a wayward child. She is present in every soul that chooses love instead of bitterness, that bends before the mystery of suffering and rises renewed. Her life continues to teach that holiness is not an escape from pain, but its transformation, that to find the cross is not to flee the world, but to redeem it from within. If you listen closely, even now, her voice seems to whisper through the centuries, "Do not be afraid to search the ruins. Beneath the world's brokenness, the cross still waits." And somewhere in that timeless silence, one can almost see her again. The humble woman turned empress, the empress turned pilgrim, standing on the hill of her discovery, her hands raised not in triumph but in awe. Her journey was never merely toward a relic, it was toward the heart of God. And in that journey, she became a compass for all who wander. Perhaps that is why her story endures, because every generation needs to hear it anew, that faith buried can be found again, that love cast aside can be redeemed, that beneath the ruins of the world there is always resurrection waiting to rise. And in the soft twilight of faith, where words fade into prayer, she remains, eternal, gentle, radiant, still pointing toward the cross. The soul that has seen the cross will never again walk in darkness. Across the slow passage of time, St. Helena's presence came to dwell like perfume in the air of the church, unseen, yet always perceptible, lingering wherever devotion turned toward the cross. The empires that had once worshipped strength had long since fallen silent, their stones crumbling into dust, yet her memory endured like the whisper of a psalm on the wind. In the hearts of believers, her story was not simply history, it was an inheritance. To speak her name was to remember that every soul, no matter how obscure or wounded, is called to uncover something sacred hidden beneath the ruins of the world. She was the quiet proof that grace begins where pride ends, that God chooses not the mighty, but the willing. In the centuries after her death, the devotion she inspired grew steadily, like a flame that never exhausted its oil. Across the East, she was venerated with a tenderness that transcended generations. In Byzantium, Her image appeared in mosaics of gold and lapis, standing beside her son, Constantine, their faces turned toward the shining cross that rose between them. The faithful called her Isapostolos, equal to the apostles, for her discovery of the true cross was seen as an act of preaching as powerful as any sermon. Her feast became one of the Church's most beloved celebrations, a day of quiet awe when the cross was lifted high before the people, the hymn of her finding filling every dome and corridor. Before thy cross, we bow down in worship, O Master, and thy holy resurrection we glorify. In the West, too, her name grew dear to the faithful. The relics she brought from Jerusalem, the fragments of the cross, the nails of the crucifixion, the thorns of the crown, were venerated in churches across Christendom. Her basilica in Rome, Santa Croce in Jerusalem, became a place of pilgrimage as sacred as the city she had once walked barefoot in devotion. Pilgrims came to kneel before the relics, some from distant lands, some poor and weary, others noble and adorned. Yet all were equal beneath her gaze. They prayed to the saint who had found the cross, not through privilege, but through perseverance. And they left changed, humbled, renewed, and certain that sanctity could dwell even in the humblest of lives. Through the Middle Ages, her story took on a luminous poetry. Bards sang of her faith. Chroniclers wrote of her discovery with reverence. In dim candlelight, monks illuminated her life in gold and ink, tracing the story of her search across vellum pages that still survive. They wrote not of conquest, but of pilgrimage, of the long labor of one who dug through the earth not for treasure, but for truth. And so, Helena's life became a spiritual mirror for all who sought God amid the dust of the world. Her discovery of the true cross was retold as an allegory of the soul, that every human heart, if it digs deep enough through the layers of sin and sorrow, will one day find Christ waiting beneath. There were centuries of darkness when the world seemed to forget the sacred in pursuit of power and pleasure. Yet even then, her name flickered quietly in the prayers of the faithful. When war raged through the Holy Land, soldiers and pilgrims alike carried small crosses carved from olive wood, invoking her protection. In times of plague, her image was set upon altars as a reminder that the cross heals not only bodies, but hearts. Even when the relics of the true cross were lost, stolen, or scattered, her spirit seemed to whisper through the chaos. What is holy cannot be buried forever. The faithful believed that she still walked unseen, guarding what she had once found, ensuring that no generation would ever truly forget the price and promise of redemption. As centuries yielded to new ages, the language of faith changed, yet her story remained constant. The Renaissance rediscovered her as an icon of virtue, a woman who had united reason with faith, who had used power not for glory, but for goodness. Artists painted her with soft, steady eyes, her hands resting upon the cross, as if upon the very heart of the world. Poets wrote of her not in marble grandeur, but in the music of quiet strength. To them, she was the embodiment of the human soul reaching upward through time toward the eternal, proof that history itself bends toward grace. In the modern age, when the noise of the world grew louder and faith seemed sometimes like a forgotten language, her story again found new meaning. People who no longer bowed before thrones or relics still found comfort in her journey. She had been lowly, scorned, and cast aside, and yet she had found her way to the center of the world's redemption. Her story spoke to those who suffered silently, to those who had lost their place in a world that worshipped success. She reminded them that every life, no matter how ordinary, holds within it a divine calling. The cross was buried, she seemed to say, and so too was I. but both were raised again by love. In pilgrim hearts, she lives as a guide of the soul's long road. Her footsteps echo in every journey of faith, from the dusty trails of Jerusalem to the quiet pews of country churches. She is the companion of the weary traveler, the whisper in the heart of those who search for meaning in pain. Her story is told not just by priests and scholars, but by mothers comforting children, by the sick praying in their hospital beds, by the poor lighting candles in the darkness. Her name has become a kind of prayer itself, gentle, steadfast, enduring. Perhaps that is the truest miracle of Saint Helena, not the finding of the cross, but the transformation of her life into one. Her humility became the wood upon which love triumphed, her suffering, the nails that fixed faith into the heart of the world. Through her, the cross ceased to be a symbol of defeat and became a sign of hope eternal. The woman once forgotten by emperors became a mother to generations of believers, her memory lighting their way through centuries of change and doubt. Even now, when pilgrims gather in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or kneel before the relics in Rome, they do not feel far from her. The air still seems to carry the quiet breath of her prayers, the fragrance of her faith. They imagine her kneeling there beside them, the lines of age upon her face, her hands clasped as they once were when she whispered to God in the dust of Golgotha, "Let me find what was lost." And perhaps, in the stillness that follows every prayer, she answers with the same peace that filled her heart when the cross was raised before her eyes. Her story ends, yet it never truly concludes, for the cross she found continues to rise wherever faith endures. It stands in every act of mercy, in every moment of forgiveness, in every soul that turns its face toward light. Helena's journey is the journey of the Church itself, a long, patient search through darkness toward redemption. And as long as that search continues, her spirit walks beside it, guiding the way. Beneath the noise of time, beneath the dust of kingdoms, beneath the weary heart of the world, her voice remains, soft, certain, everlasting. Seek, and you will find. For faith, like the cross, is never truly lost. It waits to be uncovered anew in every generation, in every humble soul willing to kneel and begin again. The heart that carries the cross carries eternity within it. The centuries unfolded as if time itself were a long, deep breath, and through that breath the name of Saint Helena continued to live. Her story was no longer bound to the marble of churches or the gold of reliquaries. It had slipped quietly into the language of the soul, where memory becomes prayer and history becomes the murmur of faith. The woman who once walked among soldiers and emperors had long since crossed into eternity, yet her footsteps still echoed in the hearts of those who sought meaning in their suffering. The relic of the true cross might rest in silver and glass, but the greater relic, the faith she revealed, was alive in every act of devotion that rose from love rather than pride. In the quiet corners of monasteries, monks copied her story still. Their pens traced her journey across parchment, each word a candle lit against the dark. They wrote of her pilgrimage to Jerusalem not as a tale of conquest, but as a parable of the interior life. The soul digging through the layers of pride, doubt, and pain to find beneath it the wood of the cross, the place where God meets humanity. When they lifted their eyes from the page, they often gazed upon her image, the serene face, the steady hands, and felt that she was looking back at them, as if reminding them that holiness begins not in grand visions, but in the decision to keep walking when the way is hard. Her life became a lesson told in whispers, passed from generation to generation. The noble learned from her humility. the poor from her perseverance. Artists and preachers alike found in her story the perfect union of grace and endurance. For Helena had not been granted an easy path. She had known humiliation, loss, and loneliness, and she had not turned bitter, but bright. She had taken the fragments of her pain and, through faith, transformed them into the foundation of love. Her story taught that suffering, embraced with trust, becomes a bridge between earth and heaven. And so she lived on, not as a figure of the past, but as a mirror in which each believer might see their own path to redemption. The Middle Ages gave her many titles: Finder of the Cross, Mother of the Church, the Empress who knelt. Yet even those who sang her praises understood that her greatness lay not in the title, but in the gesture of her kneeling. She had been the most powerful woman of her time, yet she had bent low before the earth, searching in the dust for a fragment of wood. That image lingered in the imagination of the faithful like a living prayer. To kneel as she had knelt became, in the hearts of many, the truest imitation of Christ. It was a humility that spoke louder than any sermon, an act that transcended the ages, an empress on her knees, finding in weakness the doorway to eternity. When the Renaissance dawned, and the world once again turned its gaze toward beauty and power, Helena's story remained as a gentle counterpoint. Painters depicted her surrounded by gold and light, yet even in the grandeur of their art, her humility shone through. In the great frescoes of cathedrals, she stood not as a conqueror, but as a seeker. The cross she held was not a symbol of authority, but of surrender. Poets, captivated by her faith, called her the mother who found heaven's shadow, meaning that she had seen divine light through the veil of human sorrow. Philosophers pondered her transformation: the tavern girl who rose to imperial dignity, the woman scorned who became the church's matriarch. And they wondered what secret of the heart could make such grace possible. The answer, of course, was simple. She had loved God more than herself. Even in modern centuries, when the world grew restless and belief was questioned, her story remained unshaken. She belonged not only to history, but to the universal longing that beats within every soul, the desire to find meaning, to uncover light beneath the weight of existence. Her name was invoked by those who searched for lost faith, by those who wandered far from the church and found themselves yearning, like her, for something eternal buried beneath the noise of the world. In her they saw that redemption is not an escape from pain, but the discovery of God within it. Pilgrims still walk in her footsteps. They stand before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, hearing the low chant of priests that echoes beneath its ancient domes. And they think of her, the empress who had once stood there, weathered by time, her heart trembling as she uncovered the wood that had borne salvation. The stones beneath their feet seem almost to hum with her memory. They touch the cold rock of Calvary, and in that moment every distance of time collapses. It is as though she stands beside them again, her hand upon the cross, her face lit with the same quiet awe that changed the world. In her story, they find courage to lift their own crosses, to bear them with dignity and faith. The mothers of every generation have found comfort in her, seeing in her strength the reflection of their own. She had loved her son with a love both fierce and tender, and through him she had helped to shape the destiny of an empire. Yet she had never sought to rule him. She had taught him by example. Even when separated by power and distance, she had remained his compass, her prayers the unseen guard of his heart. And so she became, for all time, the patron of mothers who pray for their children, the patient intercessor who understands both the ache of worry and the joy of trust. Her feast day comes and goes each year, but it is not bound to a calendar. It lives in every moment of surrender, in every act of quiet devotion. When a soul chooses forgiveness instead of anger, when someone bends to help the poor, when faith endures through darkness, Helena's spirit moves again through the world. The true cross may rest in relics, but its living reflection shines in every soul she inspires. She had once said, according to legend, that she sought not to own the cross, but to serve the one who was nailed to it. And so, even now, her life continues to serve him, her memory drawing hearts back to the simplicity of love that asks for nothing in return. Perhaps, at the end of all things, when time folds back into eternity, the story of St. Helena will be told once more, not in words or books, but in light. Perhaps we will see her walking again through the streets of Jerusalem, the dust rising softly around her feet, her eyes fixed on the hill where the cross once stood. Perhaps we will hear her voice, not in command, but in wonder. Lord, you were never lost. It was we who had forgotten where to look. And perhaps, in that eternal morning, every heart that has ever sought, wept, and believed will stand beside her, sharing her gaze of love fulfilled. For her life was never about discovery alone. It was about the transformation that comes when one allows faith to turn sorrow into joy. Helena found the cross once, but she continues to help the world find it again and again, in every age, in every heart, in every act of mercy that dares to believe in resurrection. Her story is not finished, for the cross still stands, and where it stands, she still kneels. The love that finds the cross never ceases to search, and the soul that searches with love never fails to find. When the centuries grew old, and the world seemed to lose its memory of beginnings, there remained, somewhere deep in the rhythm of the church, the steady heartbeat of St. Helena's name. Her life had passed into that realm where holiness is no longer remembered through words alone, but through the quiet gestures of devotion that repeat themselves endlessly. The lighting of a candle, the kneeling before a cross, the whisper of a mother's prayer at dusk. The empires she had known were gone, their triumphs erased by time, yet her story endured. Not because it belonged to the powerful, but because it belonged to the heart. The empress who had once worn jewels and silks had been stripped by death of all earthly glory, yet in losing everything, she had become the mother of countless souls. Her memory, like the cross she had found, could not decay. It was alive, beating softly within the faith of every generation that came after her. In the long years after her death, her relics were moved from place to place, and wherever they went, they left behind an aura of peace. The faithful gathered around them, touching the marble of her tomb as though seeking to draw courage from its stillness. Even those who knew little of her life felt the strange familiarity of her presence. They knew, without needing to be told, that she was one of them, a woman who had suffered, loved, and endured. And so the churches that bore her name multiplied across the world. In small villages, her statues stood beside country roads, her eyes forever lifted towards the heavens. In great cities, her likeness was cast in bronze, her hands holding the cross that had once trembled in her grasp. The contrast was always striking, her imperial robes, symbols of the world's greatness, and the rough wood she carried, symbol of heaven's. In that union lay her truth, that divine power is never apart from human weakness, but dwells within it, redeeming it from within. Those who studied her story with the mind of history often tried to measure her influence by the monuments she inspired or the relics she left behind. But her true legacy could never be weighed or counted. It existed in the quiet changes of hearts, in the renewal of faith in unseen places. The cross she uncovered became not merely an artifact, but a living sign that grace can be found where none expect it. In the monasteries of Europe, her example guided generations of pilgrims who crossed mountains and deserts seeking the sacred. In the hearts of mothers, she remained the intercessor for their children, a tender image of faith that watches without ceasing. In the lives of the sorrowful, she stood as the voice that said softly, "Endure, for the dawn always follows the night." The Church never ceased to speak her name with reverence. Her feast was kept each year with hymns of light, and in those moments the centuries seemed to fold together. The faithful, raising their eyes toward the crucifix, saw more than the wood of Christ's passion. They saw the shadow of the woman who had given that sign back to the world. Priests spoke of her in homilies, not as a queen of power, but as a queen of faith. They told their flocks that her greatness came not from being chosen by men, but from being found by God. She had walked the long road of humility, and in that journey she had transformed the meaning of devotion itself. Every pilgrim, they said, walks in her footsteps, and every act of forgiveness is a small discovery of the cross anew. In later centuries, as faith became mingled with the noise of progress and the human heart seemed to chase after lesser lights, her story remained a refuge for those who yearned for simplicity. Scholars debated her miracles, critics questioned her history, but the faithful continued to light their candles beneath her image. They knew that truth has a language deeper than scholarship. The language of love persevered through time. To them, Helena's story was not about relics, but about the interior relics of the soul, those hidden places where each person must search until the spark of grace is found. She had once dug through the earth for the cross, but her true discovery had been the realization that faith itself is the buried treasure in every human life. And so her example endured, a call to keep seeking, to keep kneeling, to keep believing that beneath the ashes of suffering lies the seed of resurrection. Pilgrims continued to travel to the Holy Land, and in every century they carried her with them. Some came from far kingdoms, some from simple homes, but all felt that she walked beside them on the dusty road to Golgotha. The stones, worn smooth by millions of feet, seemed to remember her. The air itself carried the echo of her prayers. And when they entered the great basilica she had built, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they felt her stillness there, as though she were praying unseen beside them. They knelt before the cross she had found, touching the cold wood, and felt a warmth that could not be explained. They knew then what Helena had always known, that the cross is not a relic of death, but the doorway to eternal life. Artists of later centuries depicted her not as a distant figure of history, but as a mother of consolation. Painters placed her in scenes of soft light, her face calm, her hands open. Sculptors carved her in marble, her gaze tender yet unyielding. In her features, they sought to capture something that words could not, the mystery of a soul that had seen both humiliation and glory, and had found in both the hand of God. Her story became less about the empire she had known, and more about the kingdom she had sought. The grandeur of Rome had faded into dust, but the kingdom of love she served continued to flourish in quiet hearts. And even now, when the modern world rushes past its own miracles without wonder, her story waits patiently to be rediscovered. Each time a soul chooses compassion over indifference, humility over pride, it uncovers the cross anew. Each time forgiveness is offered, or love endures despite rejection, Helena's work continues. For her discovery was not a single event in time. It was a revelation meant to echo forever. She taught that holiness is not an inheritance, but a journey, and that the map to God's heart is drawn through the valleys of loss. The day will come, as it does for all creation, when time itself will rest, when empires and cities will fall silent. Yet the faith of Helena will remain, because it was never built on stone, but on surrender. When history closes its final chapter, perhaps we will see her once more, not robed in empire, but clothed in light, the cross shining in her hands as she stands beside the Lord she sought. Perhaps she will turn, her eyes full of the same compassion she once gave to the world, and whisper to every soul who ever carried their own cross. You have found it too. Her life began in obscurity and ended in glory, but the path between was the same narrow way all hearts must walk. It was the path of love that endures rejection, of faith that survives silence, of hope that looks beyond death. She walked it first, so that we might not be afraid to follow. Her footsteps are still there, written not on parchment, but upon the earth itself, in every act of mercy, in every prayer whispered by those who still seek what she once found. And so the story of Saint Helena does not end. It rests quietly within the rhythm of the Church's breath, within the heartbeat of all who still believe. Her legacy is the same now as it was the day she first touched the cross, to remind us that God hides His glory in the simplest of places and reveals it to those who dare to look deeper. The cross remains, radiant amid ruin, and she remains beside it, eternal witness to love's victory. The crown she wears is not of gold, but of faith proven true, and its light will never fade. And so the story of St. Helena reaches its still, luminous close, the way evening follows day, not as an end, but as a deepening of light. The woman who began her life in the humble shadows of a seaside tavern now rests within the memory of the Church like a soft flame that never dies. The centuries have turned and turned again, yet her name has not grown dim. It glows quietly wherever faith seeks the face of mercy. In her, the world learned that holiness doesn't descend in thunder or in crowns, but rises instead from the ordinary soil of human struggle, from tears that have learned to pray. Her life became the map of every believer's pilgrimage, a passage from the small to the infinite, from shame to grace, from earth to the radiant threshold of eternity. As the ages unfold, the world continues to find her story renewed. In the East, she remains Isapostolos, equal to the apostles, the mother who bore an emperor, yet chose the poverty of the pilgrim's road. In the West, she is the gentle matron of the cross, the saint who turned the ruins of her own sorrow into the cornerstone of devotion. Her image stands in cathedrals, yes, but also in small village churches where flickering candles reflect on faces lined by labor. The poor, the weary, and the forgotten have always claimed her as one of their own. They see in her eyes a mercy that understands, and in her story a promise that no life is too broken to become holy. Through the centuries, her feast has been kept with quiet joy. Each year the bells ring out, their tones falling like soft rain over towns and cities, calling the faithful to remember the woman who found the cross. In processions, priests lift crucifixes high, the light catching upon the metal as if upon morning dew. Children carry flowers. Old women pray aloud for their children and grandchildren. Men bow their heads and trace the sign of redemption upon their foreheads. They do not think of Helena as a figure long dead, but as a presence that breathes beside them, the unseen companion of all who seek what was lost. In every act of remembrance, she becomes new again, her spirit threading through time as the melody of faith's endurance. Even in places where her name is seldom spoken, Her influence lingers. Every time the cross is raised upon a church spire, every time a pilgrim bends to kiss the ground of Jerusalem, her hands are there. It was she who first taught the world to look not at the power of Rome, but at the wood of Golgotha, to see not defeat, but triumph hidden in humility. The faith she helped awaken is not chained to relics or empires. It breathes through the countless lives that find strength in the mystery of the cross. And so her discovery never ended. The cross she found continues to be found, in prisons where the condemned pray for mercy, in hospitals where the dying whisper Christ's name, in the quiet hearts of those who choose forgiveness over hatred. The world keeps uncovering what she once lifted from the earth. Pilgrims still walk her path. They climb the hill of Calvary, their steps echoing in the silence, and they feel her beside them, small and steadfast, as though time itself has folded to let her pass once more. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the air is heavy with centuries of prayer. When the light of dawn touches the stone floor, some say it feels like her blessing, an ancient benediction renewed with every sunrise. In Rome, at Santa Croce, in Jerusalem, the soil she brought from the Holy Land still rests beneath the altar. Those who kneel there breathe the same dust she once gathered in her hands. They leave not only with reverence, but with a sense of kinship, as if the empress who bowed before the cross now bows beside them. Her story endures because it speaks to the deepest hunger of the human heart, the desire that one's suffering not be meaningless. Helena's life answers that longing. Her rejection became redemption. Her sorrow became her sanctity. She discovered that God does not erase pain but transforms it, just as He transformed the cross itself. And that truth has outlived every age. For every soul that feels cast aside, her story whispers, "You are not forgotten. Beneath your wounds lies the shape of the divine." The cross was her revelation, but compassion was her crown. Even now the Church calls her blessed, and the world still turns its face toward the symbol she raised. The cross she found has become the sign upon which civilizations have built their hope. It stands on mountains and in marketplaces, on the walls of homes and in the hearts of the dying. It rises above cities that know nothing of her name, yet its meaning remains the same, that love is stronger than death. And if love endures, so too does she. For Helena's life was not a monument, but a movement of the soul, an ever-expanding circle of grace that touches every generation that dares to believe. Scholars continue to write her history, tracing the paths of her pilgrimage, weighing fact against legend. But perhaps what matters most cannot be measured. The real truth of Saint Helena lies not in the accuracy of dates or the preservation of relics, but in the quiet transformation of hearts that hear her story and choose to begin again. She stands as the eternal witness that holiness is possible, that faith is worth the struggle, that the buried light can always be found. Imagine her now, not as marble or icon, but as she must be in eternity, freed from all sorrow, her hands still open, the cross shining in her grasp. Around her, the saints gather like stars, and in the center stands the one she loved, his wounds radiant with glory. She does not speak, she simply gazes, and in her gaze is every prayer ever uttered, every tear turned into light. The woman who once sought the cross has become its living reflection. Her pilgrimage is complete, and yet, through the mystery of grace, it continues in us. For every soul that chooses faith over despair, she walks again. Every time love bears pain with patience, her spirit lives anew. Her journey began in obscurity, passed through the fires of humiliation, and ended in the calm of divine union. And as the final chord of her story fades into eternity, one truth remains clear. The cross she found was never lost again. It stands now not only in the earth she once touched, but in every heart that believes. The tavern girl from Drepanum, the mother of emperors, the pilgrim of Jerusalem, she has become the saint of seekers, the guardian of those who search for God among the ruins. Her life is the gentle assurance that no one is too low to be lifted, no one too forgotten to be found, and no sorrow too deep for resurrection. Perhaps that is why her story soothes the weary even today. It does not demand wonder. It invites trust. It teaches that holiness is not a distant glory but a quiet persistence, the choice to keep faith when all seems hidden. And in that quiet persistence, every believer walks the same road she once walked. The cross still waits to be uncovered, not in the ground, but in the heart. And she, the first to find it, still guides the way, steadfast, compassionate, eternal. Perhaps, in the end, every soul must become a pilgrim, seeking the hidden cross within.